All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shannon Q. We are going to have an awesome conversation tonight. Just a few little housekeeping items to get out of the way. First, my laptop died, so I'm using a desktop computer that I refurbished myself. So if there's a little bit of a lag, then I apologize. It's an older computer, but the conversation should still be going through. Let me know how everything's going technically. Also, thank you to Brant for sending me a super chat yesterday saying he's going to be at work, so just take my money now. I appreciate that, Brant. I promise all super chats will be read, and that includes Brant's from yesterday. So thank you, Brant. And tonight we have two fantastic guests on that I'm really excited to have a chat with. We are going to be talking to Digital Hammurabi, which is Josh and Megan, and Pragmatic Culture. The links to their channels are in the description, both of them, so please go and check them out. And we are going to be having a discussion about who the Bible is written for. So first, I would like to give you two an opportunity, or you three rather, an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself and tell everybody where they can find you. So we'll start with you, Josh and Megan, if you'd like to just introduce yourselves to everybody.
Hi guys, we're Digital Hammurabi. I'm Megan and this is Josh. It'd be a bit weird if I was Josh and he was Megan, but somehow I still feel the need to say that every time we're on air. I'll just get us name tapes next time. That'll be great. We're Digital Hammurabi. We are two Assyriologists. Josh got his PhD 2016. I'm still working on mine, which means that we spend far too much time reading dead languages, looking at objects from civilizations that died out 3,000 years ago, and generally being very geeky about very, very old stuff. Our channel is based on academia and making academia accessible to people who are, well, just have more important things to do with their lives than we do, very basically. Josh has a Learn to Read Sumerian course. We just published his first Learn to Read Biblical Hebrew video. Yeah, we're awesome, basically.
I agree.
And we're really excited to be here.
And somehow, over the past, I guess, 18 hours, we've gone up 163 subscribers.
Yay!
I have,
it's crazy.
I don't know what it is. You know,
we pleased the YouTube.
It might be my haircut.
It's definitely your haircut.
That's got to be it. That's the only thing that makes sense.
Although Paul just said that he wants you and I to swap haircuts.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I've had his haircut before, so it's not. This is not working. We'll try that.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, both of you. And next we have Pragmatic Culture. Pragmatic Culture, introduce yourself and let everybody know where they can find you, please.
Hello, everybody. Always great to start off with but happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me on again, Shannon. And yeah, I'm just pretty much on YouTube because I'm a narcissist who likes to shout his opinions into the void and hope the void screams back at me something. I don't know. But other than that, yeah, you can find me at my YouTube channel where I hope to amass a massive enough following one day to overthrow the U.S. government and install Catholic monarchy again.
Oh, gosh. So. Oh my gosh. Good start. Good start.
Yes, exactly. So just so my intentions are clear right from the start.
Oh my God.
But yeah, you can follow my YouTube for my ramblings and my Twitter for all the short little low effort shit posts you'd expect a Twitter account to encompass. But yeah.
All right. Well, that's a fair synopsis, I guess. All right. So we'll introduce what the topic of conversation is tonight. Now that we have the introductions out of the way. So the topic of the conversation tonight is who is the Bible written for? So we have Digital Hammurabi here because they are essentially kind of experts in this area. And I am not. So I thought that this would be a really interesting dialogue to have. I've seen a lot of apologists lately kind of come out with the claims that, you know, atheists and even sort of lay Christians don't really understand the Bible in its intended form because the Bible was written for people who were of really staunch theological backgrounds to be interpreted for the masses, essentially, as opposed to being created or or made, I'm not sure what the proper word to use here is, for general consumption. And that's a lot of the issue. So I thought that it would be fair to have somebody from both perspectives here. And Prag has had a little bit of backlash because he said something along those veins in a non-SAC hangout. So I thought I'd also give him an opportunity to kind of clear the air and really sort of allow people to know what his stance is. And we'll start there. I think that's a fair place to start. So, Prag, do you want to kind of let everybody know what you had said initially and what your actual stance is on who the Bible was written for, and we'll go from there?
Yeah, sure. I think on this original stream, I did say something along the lines, well, the Bible isn't for like the lay people or something like that, which wasn't really true. Or it's not what I meant to say. And I do think I tried to clarify it to some extent on that stream, but it should be said that the Bible is indeed for everyone to read and to gain some sort of spiritual wisdom from. However, it's not for everybody to speak authoritatively on the Bible. For example, you can pick up a textbook on anything, say economics, and glean what knowledge you can from that textbook and take it in, but you can't interpret that economics textbook in whatever way you want. There's an objective way to read the textbook because it's supposed to be a set of laws and a set of principles or a set of some other things that are supposed to hold objective truth. And that's especially more true than for like an economics textbook. It's especially more true for the Bible, where you can't have everybody with their own individual interpretations of it. Otherwise, it kind of ceases to be a book of objective truth and objective good, because you have everybody with all these different interpretations about it now. And so that's where the teaching authority sort of comes in. And in the Catholic Church, at least, it's called the magisterium. And the magisterium is comprised of course, some priests and bishop who have dedicated their lives to studying the theology, studying, as you guys do right now, the ancient languages, interpreting the context, both culturally and historically and linguistically, and also the deeper philosophical meaning as well. And there are some lay people in the magisterium as well, some lay scholars who dedicate their lives, like you guys, to studying this thing. And so that's really all I would say I'd make the case for. Not that the Bible isn't for everybody, because of course everybody should be gaining wisdom from it, I think, but rather that it isn't for everybody to go out and make definitive statements on. Like, your average person shouldn't be claiming, oh, this is what the Bible says definitively, and this is how it's meant to be read, and things like that. Like, I don't think the lay people should be making authoritative statements like that.
So just to clarify before we go forward, would you say, in your opinion, the magisterium of the Catholic Church are the ones who have the authority to make those statements?
Yeah, it would be the magisterium. It's many different representatives and such. Obviously, there's, the Pope comes into it, and the fact that he can issue infallible statements based on, well, he can't just issue infallible statements. They can only pertain to morals and church teachings. And there also have to be certain conditions met before he can preach an infallible statement. But it's along those lines. Yeah, only the magisterium has like the definitive interpretation.
Okay. All right. So I'll turn it over to you two on Digital Hammurabi. What would you say that either supports or counters that position based on what you know about biblical construction?
Can I just ask for a point of clarification first?
Absolutely. Please go
Prag,
ahead.
are you saying that the Catholic Church holds a monopoly on the interpretation of the Bible?
Well, as a Catholic, I would say that, as I don't believe in the, of course, various Protestant sects, and I don't believe in the validity of their interpretations and their Bibles per se. But of course, I understand you and I are going to differ on that thing. But yes, I would say the Catholic Church has the monopoly in that respect.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some senses, I would go a step further and say that unless you know Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, you can't read the Bible, right? So, I mean, in a very pragmatic sense, any layperson that's reading the Bible is doing so through scholarship, right? So, I mean, I think that's a very extreme way to go, but I mean, I think we have to start with that basis, right? So, you can't, when the Bible was originally written, it was written to a culture that spoke a very different language, a people group that spoke a very different language. And we don't speak that language anymore, right? So just like any other ancient text. So I suppose that's where you have to begin with this. Now, I would argue, obviously, very quickly that I don't believe, I'm going to obviously differ with Pragmatic Culture and his understanding of the divine nature of the text. So I'm almost taking a step back even further and saying, the arguments that we could make from inside of the text that talk about, its audience or its intended purpose. Those are things that we, in my opinion, we sort of have to turn the volume down on what the Bible is saying and look at what the Bible is doing as an ancient text. In the same way that we have to turn down what the Enuma Elish is doing, the Akkadian text that's talking about Marduk creating the universe. We have to kind of turn Marduk's voice down. We have to turn the volume down on the text itself and what it's saying, and look at what the text is doing objectively. And when you do that to the biblical text, you come up with some very different, I think, conclusions on its intended audience and its intended purpose. Whereas if you turn the volume up on what the text itself purports, what it reports about itself, and you're going to come up with very different conclusions. And I think that's probably where Pragmatic Culture would fall, is turning the volume up on what the text itself is saying about itself, and then drawing conclusions theologically about that. I would take great issue, obviously, with the Catholic Church having the monopoly on biblical interpretation. I mean, and I understand why you do it, Prag, because that's your faith. I get that, and I won't knock that from that vantage point. I would say that as an academic and somebody that reads these languages and works in this culture and everything linguistically, I think that's silly from that perspective, because it takes an awful lot to understand those biblical texts. And so I don't think the monopoly should be on a religious organization that declares that because they say it, that it's the infallible interpretation of God's word, but it should be, people in academic circles interacting with people in the mainstream or non-academic circles to determine what it is that these texts mean, if you want to interpret them divinely in that sense. That probably didn't make any sense, all that rambling that I just did. Oh, good.
Megan endorsed. So, Prag, what makes you think that the Catholic magisterium has this monopoly on being able to understand the theological interpretation? So on what authority? Is it simply because you ascribe to be Catholic that you're donning them, like you're attributing that authority to them? Or do you have something external that allows you to say, okay, based on my objective look externally and my understanding of the text and my assessment of other religions, this one seems to be most representative? I guess I just don't understand what gives them that authority in your eyes as opposed to anybody else when it's kind of a subjective activity interpretation at all.
Yeah, okay. I'll just respond to some quick points about sort of like turning up and down the volume and things like that, because I think it'll kind of tie into your question, Shannon.
Absolutely. Take your time, please.
And one thing I certainly agree with is that obviously there's, you have to, in looking at the Bible, you can certainly go about it and think, what is the Bible saying versus what is the Bible doing? I think that's a very reasonable way of going about examining it, as it's very much sort of a letter of the law versus spirit of the law kind of question. And it's completely valid to interpret it and look at it from that perspective in order to see what it's really trying to do and in order to get a fuller picture. Because obviously, there's something to say that there's a spirit of the Bible, and then there's also some very legalistic readings of the Bible as well that may be more or less charitable depending on how you lean, but that's certainly an open question. As for sort of what you were describing towards the end, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you were describing a more sort of secular look at the Bible, so to speak. Would you think it's sort of fair to describe that as how you were looking at the Bible, or describing how to look at the Bible towards the end there?
I mean, if you're defining secular as looking at the biblical texts as ancient documents like any other ancient documents, yes.
Yeah, okay. And that's I understand why people would like to do that, because obviously there's some sort of idea that when you strip away sort of the spirituality of something like this, or as you put it, sort of turn down what God or whoever, a prophet, was saying in that one moment, that, you know, you kind of get more of the sense of the historical context and what it was speaking, the actual effect it had on the people and things like that. But I sort of have a problem with this in the respect that when you sort of strip away the spiritualness to these texts, you do get a lot of radically different interpretations. And it's sort of the same problem when people try to historically interpret Jesus. Like, you can go on the History Channel and see any numbers of specials on this thing. They'll have 20 different historians or biblical scholars on it, and each will have sort of a different picture of Jesus because they've taken him out of the context of a spiritual leader and they've made him political leader. They've made him a social revolutionary or something like that. And the reason you get all these different pictures when you strip away the spirit of what Jesus was trying to do or what God was trying to do is because primarily it is a spiritual message. And so it's almost like trying to say, well, we're going to take this science textbook here and we're going to strip away sort of like this process of the scientific method in order to see what it's really getting at and what it's honestly saying. It's, you know, you're taking away one of the fundamental points of it. And so I can understand if you want to get more into the history of the thing, like the Bible, then I can understand the more looking at it as just a historical document. But the spiritual interpretation being, in my mind, the main importance of the Bible can't be ignored if you really want to get the whole picture. And sorry, go ahead.
No, you finish first, please.
Yeah, and so to kind of answer Shannon's question, the reason I think the Catholic Church has this sort of monopoly on it is, for one instance, they've been the keepers of the tradition and the scriptures and the writings themselves for the longest time. Like, obviously you have Saint Jerome was the first to translate it into Latin from the Greek and the Hebrew, and obviously his translation it isn't the one we use today. I believe it was, I can't think, somebody updated it as time went on, but I can't think of the name escapes me at this point. And so obviously, you know, there's still some inquiry that goes on in the church itself and updates are made, but they are certainly the ones with the longest tradition of working with it. And if you were to ask me, say specifically why I believe the Catholic Church over some other churches per se, well, that goes into a matter of why I believe, you know, the Catholic Church is the true church established by Jesus Christ, and why I believe we have inherited, you know, the apostles' seats and things like that. But that's why I believe, when compared to other Christian faiths, the church is the rightful inheritor of that legacy, or rightful inheritor of the authority to interpret the Bible. Now, from a secular standpoint, what I would say is it kind of relates back to why I said why you can't secularize certain spiritual texts and certain spiritual leaders. Because at the end of the day, their message was primarily spiritual, and when you miss out on that context, whether unintentionally or intentionally, you're getting less than the whole picture. And so because the Catholic Church is obviously a spiritual entity, it is in the best position, I believe, to make all those interpretations.
Okay, so I'm going to make a point and then ask Megan a question about her dissertation. I doubt that you would have a problem stripping away the spirituality of the Enuma Elish. I suspect you wouldn't have a problem with that as a Catholic in this same sense, right? So stripping away that Marduk cut Tiamat in half after killing her and threw half of her body up into the heavens to create the heavens, stretching out the hide, much the same description as what Yahweh did. and then taking her body and creating the earth, taking her eye sockets and making them the source of the Tigris and the Euphrates. That was definitely a spiritual text. I mean, no question about it. It's a ritual text. So stripping away the spirituality of that to get back to what it is that they were doing, I doubt that would be problematic, right? I don't think I suspect you would never have a problem with that. But so you can address that. But Megan is writing her dissertation on royal inscriptions, and royal inscriptions, they're essential. I don't want to take your, but royal inscriptions are inscriptions by kings that basically say, I am amazing. I can do everything wonderfully. I build the greatest things. I have the biggest penis.
See,
I knew it. I said, how long? That's oh gosh.
All right. Well, so Megan,
yes, Joshua.
Can we take royal inscriptions at face value?
Sure, you can. I really wouldn't recommend it.
Why?
Because they're hyperbole, because they're a product of their culture. And the point you're getting at is the Bible is a product of its culture. And I think if you take it out of the culture who wrote it, regardless of the spirituality, you lose something vital about the whole point of the group of texts that make up the Bible. And I don't necessarily think you have to strip away the spirituality to understand it, but I think you do have to place it back in its original context, because the Bible today is a very, very different animal than the original Bible, the Bible of the Israelite people when they were living in the Babylonian captivity. It's completely and utterly different. And looking at these texts that were written for a very specific purpose by a group of people who are entirely and utterly alien to our own culture and society, and then trying to directly apply that text to our own lives, I think is a little bit odd. And I understand why it happens, because the Bible is, I think in a way that very few other texts are, it's kind of taken on this life of its own. So it does get just wholesale applied to modern life, but I think that's an incorrect use of it. And I do just want to bring up the point you made about historians coming up with 8 million different interpretations of the Bible, looking at it purely from a historical perspective. I'm sorry, but with or without spirituality, that happens.
Yeah,
like
welcome.
The reason we have 8 million different churches is because there are 8 million different spiritual interpretations. And I suspect your response would be along the lines of, well, the churches other than the Catholic Church have it wrong, which is fair enough. That's your worldview, but you will always have a myriad of different interpretations of the same objects, simply because we're human, because we are not living in the time in which this thing was written, and because even for stuff that is produced by our own culture, different groups of people take things and they interpret them based on their lives, based on their experiences. And because we all have different lives and different experiences, we all come up with different interpretations. And there's really no way around that. But I do think that trying to understand the time and the place that something was produced in does help to get back to a fuller understanding, maybe, of the original intention of the authors.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely understand. And there was a comment that went by in chat that kind of pertains to what you're talking about, so I'll address it, from a fellow by the name of Godless Recovery, who says PC can't take his stories out of his culture, otherwise he wouldn't be a Catholic. And that's not true. I'm not advocating for taking these stories out of their cultural context. By no means am I doing that, because of course there are things that need to be looked at from the cultural context to better understand them. For one example, I know somewhere in Paul's epistles to the Corinthians, there's some line about, to speak broadly, it's, something a lot of people go on about as misogynistic, because it's talking about the role of women in worship and how they should be subservient, something along those lines.
That your women keep silent in the churches. Yep.
Yeah, something along those lines. And I'm sure you know the story behind this. There was an epidemic going on in the churches of Corinth at the time when Paul was writing those letters, of women who were sort of barging in and making this kind of ruckus within them, sort of like the ancient Greek pussy riot, if you will. But
oh my God, Prag.
And I would just to momentarily address that. Certainly wasn't simply the women doing that.
No, of course not.
The
It wasn't
Church
just
at
the women.
Corinth was probably the most backward church, at least in Paul's writings, and one that really took 16 chapters of just discipline from him. So to isolate, I think, out the women here, and to say that's why he said that the speaking in tongues issue, I think, took up 3 chapters in the book of Corinthians, and only a part of that was because of the women. So,
oh yeah, no, of course, I'm not trying to take away from the mess that was the Church of Corinth by any means, but I'm just talking about, like you just brought up, it's important to take into context that the whole Church of Corinth at that time was a mess, and I'm perfectly willing to put it in that cultural context. And of course, I'm willing to do the same with the Old Testament, and of course, when the Jews were in captivity under the Babylonians, and as somebody, maybe not Moses, was writing down the Torah after the Jews escaped slavery in Egypt, and things along those lines. I'm perfectly willing to put it into those contexts. What I'm saying is, of course, that we have to take in the whole context, and we can't take just the cultural or just the social, but it has to be a much more holistic approach to the whole thing. So, in the same breath that we take the cultural, we must also take the spiritual at the same time, so we get the full picture. And sorry, go ahead.
I definitely agree with you there. I think the difference between what I'm saying and what you're saying is that, for me, the spirituality of the Bible is an ancient spirituality. I think it's very, very different to how many modern religious people view the world and view their own relationship with the divine. So I think that you can look at it through a spiritual lens all you want, but I still don't think, if you're using a modern lens, I still don't think you're going to be able to fully reconcile modern belief and modern society with something that is so ancient and so different to how we currently live.
And sorry, just one thing, 'cause I know we're talking a lot, Prag, I'm sorry.
No problem.
But I think we have to draw a distinction between taking the spiritual aspects of a text or a group of texts into account and believing what that text says about spirituality, in the sense that appropriating it to our lives, believing it for ourselves, believing it to apply to us, in order to understand that text. I think there's a distinction that we have to draw there. For example, it would be ridiculous for me to take the Akitu festival, to take the New Year's festival and the whole ritual that went along with that, and the worship of Marduk and his elevation during the first millennium in the Babylonian, in the realm of Babylon, or Babylonia there, to take that out of the picture, or to take that out of the picture when that text, when the Enuma Elish was taken up into the north, and they rewrote it to make Asher instead of Marduk, the chief god. It would be ridiculous for me to, in a sense, strip out the spirituality from that, because, as you say, you wouldn't understand it, because that thing is written as a spiritual text. What I'm saying that you're doing that's a step further is appropriating that spirituality for yourself. I doubt that you would appropriate Marduk as your chief god in order to understand the Enuma Elish. And I'm saying that I think that might be the problem that I'm seeing here, is that you seem to be saying I have to appropriate and believe the spirituality, the spiritual assertions that are being made in that text in order to understand it.
Is that fair, Prag?
Yes and no. And maybe yes and maybe yes and no will be right. Maybe it won't be.
Right.
I'll kind of get into
why.
So it's kind of interesting when you talk about like the spiritual validity of other texts, because you actually posited it earlier and I didn't get a chance to respond. It was just the idea that, would I be fine with stripping away the spiritual aspect of, I'm sorry, what was the name of that document that you brought up? Yeah, I would be fine with stripping away the spirituality from it in order to examine it. And I really am not sure. In some sense, yes. If I wanted to examine it as purely like a literary work, then okay, yes, we can do that. I've read sections of the Bhagavad Gita in high school and things like that. And obviously it was to strip away some of the spirituality and look at just as a purely literary work. But in the same breath, I'm also not one to sort of dismiss ancient wisdom necessarily. I'm not into wholesale dismissing any ideology personally. I think there's, little bits of truth and little bits of knowledge that can be found in everything. And so I'm willing to look at it. Of course, I believe that the Catholic Church happens to have sort of a majority stock, so to speak, in what is the truth. But I don't believe that there isn't any other truth in any other ideology per se. And so in one breath, I might be okay with sweeping it out depending on how I want to look at it. But in another sense, I would very much want to listen to what it happened to be saying if I wanted to glean some ancient wisdom from it. Because I don't know if you've heard of a book by the name of Bronze Age Mindset of All. Have you been availed to this book?
No.
Don't know.
It's a very interesting book by this gentleman on Twitter named Bronze Age Pervert, and it's very much I know, great name.
Quite the name.
Well,
Yeah.
how do I get my copy?
Well,
What does Josh
I would
fucking
genuinely recommend this book to essentially anyone: atheist, left wing, right wing, Christian, Buddhist, whoever, because it's essentially very much sort of a culmination of a lot of different ancient spiritual texts and a lot of bringing together ancient spiritual wisdom in order to see how it does apply to the modern life and modern living in the context of, the big city and man's, very separateness from nature and things like that. And so to get back to your question of appropriating things, I would be, fine with people appropriating it in terms of, using it for their daily life, because I think just because it was used in a different cultural context doesn't mean it doesn't have use or value today, especially in terms because I believe that there is some objective truth to it, if not the most objective truth out of any spiritual text. And there are philosophical reasons for that as well. To get into that would get into sort of, Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and things like that. But I do think there is more than just the spiritualness of the Bible to back up its claim of being, that of the objectively true in the moral sense. And I'd also, just to kind of finish it off here, crap, what was I going to say? I think I forgot. No, I'll leave it there then. All right.
Okay, I have a question. I'm not really certain if that answers the question Josh was posing, though. Josh essentially.
Oh, did I miss that? I'm sorry.
Well, he was essentially.
I rambled on a lot. I apologize.
I think it's okay. I think I understand the crux of your question. The crux of your question was that it seems that Prague is sort of asserting that if you don't subscribe to that ideology, like in this instance, when you're looking at the Bible, the Christian ideology, and you don't believe in that deity, then you're not going to be able to extract the appropriate things from that text. And Josh was saying, well, if you look at the Enuma Elish, are you suggesting that if you don't ascribe to that specific set of gods, that you're not going to be able to extract what you need from that text? And so I think that's the question. The question that's being asked of you, Prague, is can people extract truth or fully understand that text in a spiritual and historical context? And we could argue this back and forth as much as we want without subscribing to that God, because it sounds like you're saying the only people that can understand the text are the people that already believe that it's true. Does that make sense? Is that more concise?
Yes. Okay. I get more clearly what the question is now.
And is that fair, Josh? Did I represent your question?
Yeah,
okay?
I think so. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, then we're good. All right. Go ahead then, Brad, because I think that's the question.
Yeah. Okay. So in matters of gleaning truth, you can certainly glean truth from the Bible, whether or not you believe in it. I mean, I encourage, of course, everybody, all the listeners, go read a passage of the Bible somewhere, and you'll gain something from it. I very much believe that. And of course, I understand, to sort of get back to the point that Megan made earlier too, that people are going to come away with their own individual takes on it for what benefits them the most, and how to live out what the Bible says. Those are both true things, because obviously inner human subjectivity is a huge thing. I mean, just on a personal point, Hegel's a big influence of mine, and I've been enjoying a lot, reading a lot about him. And of course, he's like the master of human inner subjectivity. And so, of course, I understand this sort of thing that people do, where they can take anything and they can interpret it however they want, because that's just how we are. We don't think in any of the same way, because there really isn't any set right way for us to, quote, think about things. But I don't think just because we have these various interpretations and we can take from it what we want, that there doesn't mean there isn't something objectively true behind it all. And I think that's sort of where I come into a contention with this, individual interpretation thing. Because obviously, yes, there are these many spiritual interpretations also, which is how we get the various Protestant and other Christian sects. But of course, I think that where it sort of all goes awry is in this taking this inner subjectivity and claiming it to be the objective. So, obviously there are some things you can get from the Bible and, it can apply to you, and it might not be exactly what the text is meant to say, or it might not be exactly what objectively was meant. But, if you're just using it for your life and you're getting something good and helpful out of it, of course, God be with you, and I hope you live a better life because of it. But if you then go out to start preaching this, wrongness to others, to some varying degree, it could be just wrong and it could hurt people in some sense even. That's really where it kind of runs into the problem with heresies. And you had like Arius and the Arian heresy and the various Gnostic sects and things like that, is that you take it and you take this interpretation that you have, and then you then preach it to be the truth. And that's why I think there needs to be this sort of authority, because, if you're just living, quote unquote, your truth in some sense after you read the Bible, and it's just your truth and you're living a better life because of it, then that's okay. But when you try to sort of spread that and it's not really applicable to everyone, and it's doing more harm than good, or even if it's not, even if it's just wrong, and you start, a wrong belief, it's up to somebody to correct that, because, you can have wrong beliefs, obviously, that do some good, but just because they're doing some good doesn't mean they shouldn't be left alone.
So who gets to decide it's a wrong belief?
Again, I would say, to sort of go back to the question a little bit, it is, if you want to understand the document, you keep saying that, whose name I can't remember fully.
Enuma Elish. It's Akkadian for when on high. It's the first line of the exaltation of Marduk, I guess is what they describe it.
Enuma Elish. I'll try to remember that.
The creation story, the Babylonian creation myth. There you go.
Yeah, that's much simpler. Thank you. Babylonian creation myth. I would say, in some sense, in order to fully appreciate that and to fully understand it as that text, you would need to sort of believe in that ancient Babylonian religion. That doesn't mean I don't think you can't take some truth from it, but in order to fully appreciate it and to fully understand it, you would have to essentially sort of convert in some sense in order to fully get it. Now, of course, you can convert if you really believe that's the fully objective truth, but that's where I kind of get into, the St. Thomas and the other philosophical building blocks of why I think the Bible is the correct thing. And to get to the question of who gets to decide whether or not it's a correct belief, again, it's these sort of people like the Thomas Aquinas and whatnot, because they are skilled in this other philosophy in order to build up to like the theology of the Bible, and then the biblical scholars themselves who can take into account both the spiritual and the cultural. And I believe that's why they ought to have the majority say in what the Bible is directly saying. Because obviously, again, we're human, we're fallible, we're going to make mistakes as far as things go. But I don't think that means that we can't say that there's, not that there's any truth in it, but that there is indeed a more correct way than others. I think, we're able to glean that.
So if we're saying that the people who are permitted to speak to the truth of the Bible are people like Thomas Aquinas and the Church Fathers, where do the Jewish rabbinic traditions fall in on this hierarchy of what's the word I'm looking for?
Authority.
Hierarchy of authority, given that they are, you could argue, have a much more ancient connection to at least the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, than the Catholic Church does.
And if I could just tack on to that, while it might seem strange to people like us, who now are privy to not only the ancient texts that these people were privy to, But now we have the Sumerian and the Akkadian tablets that have been unearthed, for example.
Some of which, by the way, are the forerunners of the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the thing that, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, I suppose here. One of the things that I think stands out to me about this debate, and Prag, I don't want to sit here and try to convince you to not be Catholic, right? I think that's fruitless.
Kind of rude as well.
It is kind of rude, yeah. But and my grandfather used to always say, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." So I kind of live by that.
Your grandfather says.
Yeah, he does have some good stuff. A lot of stuff about cotton too. But anyway,
we should just get your grandfather.
Yeah.
No, we shouldn't do that.
He had this thing. Now we're standing in tall cotton. My father says it too. It means things are. It doesn't matter.
Is your like lineage from like the South or Dixieland or something?
No, actually, I'm from Jersey. So
wow,
He's lying.
I'm kidding.
Yes, Southern Maryland.
So
okay.
But I think one of the more complicated issues here is this idea of we have in our hands a representative text. Right, that which represents what was originally there, and I know that it's easier to just say this English translation that I have of my Old and New Testament represents at least really, really closely what was there originally. The problem is that that it were that simple, right? That's the issue. The transmission of the Old Testament text, first of all, we have none of the autographs. I'm sure everybody in this hangout knows that, but just for anybody that doesn't in the audience, we have no autographs, right, of the Hebrew Bible.
Autographs of the original copies, the original.
That's right. So whatever first Isaiah or second Isaiah or the Deuteronomistic school history school, whatever hit the parchment, or whatever, we don't have that anymore, right? And we don't have the copies from that. The first copy, the first manuscript or second manuscript. What we have is essentially redactions of redactions, right? I mean, this is really where we end up with something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So, and that's what, 2nd century, 1st century BCE. Now, interestingly enough, in our field of Assyriology, where we read Sumerian and Akkadian on cuneiform tablets, we have those. We have cuneiform tablets from 3300, 3200 BCE, right? We got them. Like, you can see the thumbprints when they wrote them. And even with that, the practice of trying to figure out what the original said, given that there was an original, if we understand there was an original in that sense, the practice of trying to get back to that is called textual criticism, right? We have these original tablets that the scribes wrote, and my dissertation advisor, my PhD advisor, wrote a book on Sumerian textual criticism. We have the tablets, and you still have to do textual criticism. So I guess what I'm saying is that we are in the best possible position.
And we still don't know what the hell's going on.
Right? It's still complicated.
That's a little pessimistic.
Yeah, but I mean,
it's still very challenging.
It's still difficult. And so I guess what I'm saying is that is a great situation compared to where we are with the Bible. And not only that, but now you're having to gain a certain level of expertise in these languages in order to make any type of authoritative argument. That being said, as pessimistic as all of that was, and then I promise I will shut up. I promise. As pessimistic as all that was, one of the things that I would hate to see is, for simplicity's sake, or at best, or for a manipulation and control purpose, at worst, I would hate to see a particular group of people monopolize all authority on a particular text and to withhold that text from people that want to learn to read it and understand it. And so this backlash, and of course, I think this has happened, right? This backlash during the Reformation period where you have people like Luther and Calvin who are fighting back against this, to demonize them in any way or to say that they were at fault for doing what they did, I think is, wrong, because I think it's trying to take out of anything that takes understanding out of a controlling monopoly, right, of a controlling source, and trying to
democratize?
No, like I can never remember this word. In a scholarly way, responsibly.
Like the Prag's trying to help you.
Thank you. Responsibly interpret these texts, I think, is exactly what we should be doing. So I'm done.
All right. All right, Prag, I'll let you talk in 1 sec. I just have to read a super chat because I'm super psyched when I get them. So this is from Godless Recovery. And Godless Recovery says, I'm never awake for live streams. I'm so glad to catch Digital Hammurabi in this debate. More of a discussion, but thank you. And your patience, insight, and genuine kindness is always a delight to hear.
Thank you, Godless
I agree.
Recovery. That's really nice.
They're great.
And you get the nicest super chats on all of political YouTube, I got to say.
I do, right? My audience is the best.
They are
Love
awesome.
my audience.
They're really
so
nice.
awesome.
There's no like mad screaming arguments in the chat at the moment, which is fantastic.
Well, it's because Jesus is Lord isn't in there, so.
Don't invoke his name. All right, fine.
Going to be your
Don't say it 3 times. All right, Prag, sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt, and I didn't mean to interrupt the flow of the debate, but I wanted to make sure I got that in because somebody was kind enough to pay to have to say something to us. So yeah, please, Prag, floor is yours. Go ahead.
Okay, so there were kind of 2 questions there, and I'll address the first one first because it's sort of short and easy to answer. In terms of where the Jewish elders and such fall in terms of authority in interpreting, especially the Old Testament, which of course they were the original keepers and writers of, so to speak, or not so to speak, literally, depending on how direct their lineage is and such. But they would certainly be up there, and I wouldn't deny them sort of a quasi-access to the magisterium, so to speak, because they obviously, we do share a Bible in some sense, especially those ancient texts. And I don't know specifically how recent some of the newer endeavors have been, but there's been a fair history of the Catholic Church reaching out to the Jewish community writ large as, diaspora Europe, and going back to the diaspora Europe and things like that, on how to interpret certain things. I mean, obviously, there's, of course, the Greek connection that you had under Alexander and the Greek Empire, where all the Jews sort of translated things into Greek. And of course, the Romans had great respect for Greece. So there was that there was a decent flow of information between the two. So the Catholic Church does have good access to it as well. But of course, we're always trying to work with the Jewish community in some sense. But at the end of the day, because the Catholic Church is a Christian faith and primarily built on the New Testament, as the primary foundational documents, it's less important what the Jewish authorities have to say on the matter, as the Catholic Church is obviously more focused on the Christ part of the Bible than what came before it to some extent. Now, in regards to the sort of what I actually liked as a good description, the democratization of the Bible, so to speak. No, I like that word a lot because, to speak bluntly, I'm not a fan of democracy simply because I view it very much as mob rule, and I have absolutely zero faith in the mob 100% of the time. And while I do agree there are certain people within the mob who, of course, might be experts, they inevitably have to dilute their opinion to, make it palatable to the general public. And so while I think those specialized individuals are fine to come forth and posit their interpretations, it should be noted that, they are specialists amongst the many in some sense. And so one of the things about Martin Luther is, of course, priests at that time were trained much better than they were, but he wasn't specifically trained necessarily to do what he did, which was reinterpret a lot of scripture and end up ditching books. Like, he wasn't qualified to do that. He cataloged relics back in the day. And, one of the reasons he got so pissed is because he actually saw a lot of forgeries, and then, of course, the indulgences thing. And, that's kind of what set him off along his way. And, of course, but he didn't have the full training of some of his peers at the time in order to really interpret scripture. Like I said, he just sorted relics. And so to do what he did is a perfect example of what happens if you take this sort of democratization too far, because even though he was a priest, he was by no means qualified to do what he did. And so that's why I worry about it, not so much, being tossed to the general public and people coming up with their own interpretations, but people then going on to make claims and speak as if they were an authority on the matter in some respect. And
what would have qualified him? I don't mean to interrupt you, but just so we don't lose that, what would have made him qualified to do that?
I think it would have lended to his credence a bit more if he were, not everybody has to be a Thomas Aquinas. That's a very high bar to set. But there were other, and I can't think of their names off the top of my head, but there were people who corresponded with Luther, his sort of fellow priests who he was friendly with before things got way out of hand, that talked with him, and they were themselves scriptural authorities. Obviously, they're not as well known as Thomas Aquinas, and they didn't do the work of Thomas Aquinas and things like that. But they were people still specially trained to just deal with the scripture specifically.
Right,
and
but
some sort of specialization.
Sorry, can you be more specific? I don't mean to push you on this, but I'd like to go somewhere with it. What made them more specially qualified?
It was certainly one of the things you talked about, which I agreed with very much, the fact that they knew all three languages of the ancient Bible, the ancient Hebrew, the Greek, and the Latin, which of the three, I think, obviously you have to know some Greek to give a mass like Luther. So he knew some Greek, but I don't think he knew it to the extent that the others did. He certainly didn't know the Hebrew, and obviously mass was given in Latin at that time, so I know he knew the Latin as well. But even some of the more foundational sort of philosophical underpinnings of the Bible, perhaps more of the textual criticism, as you were talking about, because a lot of that is done with the Bible because, like with the Torah, it was mainly kept as an oral tradition at first. And there were those who had kept the oral tradition more that he could have consulted as well or studied under, something along the lines of that, things of that nature that would have made him a bit more credible. I can't say even if he had those qualifications, I would endorse what he did, because I think it's so, it's essentially flaunting what was at the time 1,500 years of church tradition and scripture up to that point. And I think, if Thomas Aquinas himself were to have done it, I still would disagree with him. Even if I appreciated all of the works that he'd done up to that point, I would still have disagreed with him on doing that. But it would have given him a bit more credence in doing so.
Can I ask about that? And I'm really not trying to go down any rabbit holes here. What does the 1,500 years of tradition have to do with that?
Okay, that's a very good question, because there's tradition and scripture and things like that are two things that I believe are necessary components of the faith, because I was actually speaking to someone about it last night, and he gave a good example. Obviously, if you have the sort of ability to teach someone to swim, but you can only, it really well, but you can only write it down in a book with no pictures, it's going to be incredibly hard to teach someone to swim that way. Now, obviously, you can use pictures in the book, and that might help a little bit, but I think we could agree that probably the best way to teach someone to swim, or the best way on average to teach someone to swim, is by getting in there and showing them yourselves, by showing them how to do it, showing them the motions yourselves, helping them out in the water. And that is what I would compare the tradition of the church to. It is the actual lived experience of what the scripture informs. And it is so important, I think, to hold on to this, because obviously the Bible is one key to spirituality and, living fully as a Catholic Christian, or as just a Christian back in those days before schisms and such. But it's very, it's even more necessary. It's just as necessary as it was back then to engage in it today, of course. But it's two sides of sort of the same spiritual coin. It's, again, sort of a letter of the law versus spirit of the law type of thing in the debate between the two. But of course, you still need both in order to not only have the proper understanding of it, but to live it out fully.
Okay, so just if I could, to recap, it sounds like what you're saying is that the two things that were very important that Martin Luther did not have were the education concerning the original languages to a higher level, and 1,500 years of tradition behind him. Is that fair?
Yeah, the second I would say being the more important one again, because I think because again, it's sort of like, you're completely abandoning half of what Christ instituted on earth. Because I would consider the traditions of the church something Christ himself instituted, and therefore, it's something that's objective and not really up for interpretation to some extent.
How would you respond to, let's say, I don't know, someone in the Seleucid period who has been following Mesopotamian religion? He's part of a tradition that's been going on for about 3,000 years. And the tradition is pretty similar. I mean, we have, obviously Oppenheim would argue that you can't write a Mesopotamian religion, as we have talked about in our daily data. A little plug for our channel there. But,
link in the description.
But that being said, I think that other scholars, Botero, for example, have argued, I think, pretty clearly that there are, and people more recently as well, that Mesopotamian religion was actually very, very consistent in many ways. And the Sumerian language made that possible in a lot of ways. So for someone that is on the tail end of 3,000 years of a fairly consistent religious tradition that they would have said had been founded by the gods, that wanted to, if someone wanted to turn from that, would you object to it, and why?
Would I object to them turning from the 3,000-year-old Mesopotamian tradition? Is that essentially it?
Yep.
I mean, no, because I'd try to convert them myself first and foremost. But
even though they have twice as much religious tradition behind them than the Catholic Church does currently.
Well, it's not the length of the tradition that matters. It's who did the founding of the tradition that I would say is
it's the Catholic tradition as opposed to any other tradition.
I mean, that's Prag. I mean, I want to make sure that that's the clear part here, right? Mm-hmm. Because it did seem like 1,500 years of tradition was a big deal. 1,500 years.
Yeah, well, okay.
Then when we said 3,000 years, it was, well, now wait a minute.
Matter because it's the wrong tradition.
I'm not trying to pick on you. But I do.
I am. I'm being mean.
Megan's the worst. The worst human.
No, I understand the what might appear as the discrepancy, of course. Of course, the 1,500 years of traditions comes when it matters specifically to a faith you're claiming to represent. Because at the time, essentially, there was just the Christian faith, if we're leaving out the Eastern Orthodox here for just a second. And all respect to the Orthobros, of course. But to talk about the tradition is, of course, the length isn't just what was important, although it was the fact that it was a tradition that he was going to go on to claim to represent, a tradition founded by the same person, and then flaunt everything that person had sort of founded and was continued on by the people who he entrusted it to for so long, and then and go in a radically different direction with it, and claim something completely different or completely contrary to what everybody else at the time wasn't doing. And I'm not claiming that just because everybody else was doing it, it was good. Again, it was the intelligentsia and it was the magisterium of the Catholic Church maintaining these traditions.
It does kind of sound like, though, it sounds like you've started with your main presupposition, your main premise, which is the Catholic faith is the one and only true faith, which is fine. It's absolutely fine. But I do think that I want to kind of push a little bit here and there, because I think it's important for us all to realize that ultimately, when it comes to religious tradition and religious belief, you ultimately have to go back to a presupposition that your belief is the right one, right? And you can get that from subjective evidence. You can get that from, internal feelings, internal consistency, something that you see as God speaking to you, interacting with the divine, whatever. But in reality, I think, in my opinion, and just listening here, I think it's, further demonstrated that you're coming at this with a presupposition that your belief is the right one, and then making the data kind of fit, which again, I'm not necessarily opposed to.
I think everyone does it to one extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, I think it's something that we need to engage with and be aware of.
Mm-hmm. So to talk about that somewhat briefly, I don't disagree with the notion that obviously, to put it, how did you put it? Because I think you put it well. That, well, I'm trying
what I said.
Don't expect Josh to remember things he said.
I'm sorry, because somebody just walked in and I got a little bit distracted. But no, there is, of course, on some level going to be this sort of subjectivity and this sort of belief that, things, we presuppose a lot of things in our daily lives in order to get what we do. But there'd be a couple of things. To argue about the specific validity of the Catholic Church over, say, some other Protestant sect, it would again go down to, correct scriptural interpretations, not only based on like the spiritual context, but also the historical context, the linguistics and things like that. And, that'd be one side of the debate. Now, to argue about the truth of it from a larger context in terms of, what it takes to build it, that you'd need to, of course, again, I keep invoking his name a lot because I invoke the name
Aquinas.
Yes, Aquinas.
Jesus Aquinas.
I'm a mean Thomist. That's what I am. I'm a mean Thomist. But
Did I just get bingo?
Yeah, it's like if you've been punching your cards every time I say Thomist, by the 9th time I mention Thomist, you can go to your local Catholic church and receive a free bag of wafers.
I think people would rather have the free indulgence, man.
Yeah.
That's right.
I can't give out those. I don't have the authority. But but no, truth against. So to summarize briefly, truth vis-a-vis the other Christian sects, again, is going to come down to some sort of scriptural debate. And obviously, I'm not the most qualified to make it that case. I will make the case, of course, though, because it's what I believe to be true.
Who is? Prag, who is?
Today, like speaking modernly?
Yeah, I mean, okay. I've got a lot of biblical training. I know the languages. I know the ancient Near Eastern culture. I want to debate somebody about this. Who am I going to?
It's a fair question. You know what? I have a list somewhere. Hold on.
No. I don't need to. I guess the reason that I ask that is that, see, like your conclusions, you're relying, and I think you would admit that, I think you probably stated that already, that you're relying on people above you as you view them to tell you what is what the correct interpretation is. I guess what I'm saying is it sounds like to this point, when we talked about Martin Luther and the other reformers, that the big problem that they had was that they didn't have the training, right? You seem to keep going back to that. They need the training. They need the training. Do you think that it's true that the Catholic Church has in its magisterium, if I'm hearing that word right, I don't know much about the Catholic Church, sorry, that they have the people that are most qualified in the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek New Testament, in the Aramaic, in the other ancient Near Eastern languages, in ancient Near Eastern culture? Do you think that they're the ones that have the most qualified people, and why?
Well, yeah, I would say that the magisterium is the largest body of qualified people to study that sort of thing, simply because the church has gone out, and of course, it's a part of the church's mission to have the correct interpretation of this stuff and to have the correct understanding of it in order to properly proselytize and so forth. And so they've made it their mission in part to gather the best known people to study it and to train more people to study it from the other previous great scholars of the past in order to continue to have the best interpretation and so forth. So I would say the Catholic...
Sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's my channel. Every once in a while I like to talk.
Sorry.
No, you guys are, this is way more interesting than anything that I have to say. The only the kind of the question I have for Prag, I guess, is so somebody like Josh or Megan, somebody who has all of the qualifications that you listed off that you feel as though the magistrate has, but you say that the magistrate is employing people, if for lack of a better term, or seeking out people or utilizing people that are the best qualified for deriving the truth from this text because they have all of the qualifications that the two people that you are speaking to have. But though the two people you're speaking to come to different conclusions, right? So do you not see why there might be a disparity there and why the cards or the deck might be stacked when the Catholic Church chooses which people get to make those interpretations, and why that in fact makes it subjective and sort of suspect when it comes to deriving truth from a perspective like mine?
No, I can completely understand what you're talking about in terms of, especially, of course, you know, when you have a large body claiming monopoly over something, obviously there's going to be some suspect. I would never deny that. And it is, you know,
with biased motives, like if they want to keep people in the church, right? So
yeah, of course, to some extent. I definitely see what you're talking about. What I would say is, of course, that not simply that the church is true, yada yada yada, but
well, you yada yada the Reformation, so why not?
I saw.
I've yada yada Reformation.
Who hasn't, right?
If I were to paraphrase a somewhat famous quote, I would, and this is, I think I've tweeted this out before, something along the lines of the Protestant Reformation and, oh God. Oh yes, the Protestant Reformations and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. There we go.
Oh, it's definitely been a disaster for the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would consider that tweet to be unbiased. Right?
Yes, no, of course. There's heavy bias. I make no qualms about my bias. But I'm not saying that. Obviously, you know, you're not allowed to not question the magisterium, or to put it in the positive, you're allowed to question the magisterium.
Okay.
So it's to get rid of all the stupid negatives. You're allowed to question the magisterium. It's a body, of course, like I've mentioned, open to change, owing to the fact that as humans, we are, of course, fallible, and stuff, of course, needs to be updated and so forth and so on. And I would more than welcome, you know, you guys discussing it with, somebody on. When I said list, I didn't mean a list of people who you could go on and debate. I happen to be building just a personal reading list of, you know, theological scholars, biblical scholars, philosophers, in some extent, and, you know, just for my own personal uses. But there are certainly people. I think one of the more prominent ones, I imagine you could probably, I don't know if you would be willing to, but you could probably talk to somebody, say like a Bishop Barron type figure. I believe he's someone knowledgeable enough in that area, especially owing to the fact that, you know, he's very public with his proselytization. And so I'm sure he's made himself very up and up on the topics that would be discussed in certain scriptural interpretations. So, of course, it's not that the magisterium is necessarily this questionable body just because I believe they have the monopoly on it. You're free to go and engage with them, especially you guys, because as you are experts, like you do know the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Greek and the Latin and so forth and so on. So you are uniquely qualified. And I understand you did come to different conclusions, but I would say there's, just in the same sense that there is scripture, the reason I believe the church has a more correct tradition, more correct belief system, is because it employs that other part as well, which is the tradition, which is like the lived aspects of the scriptures. And so that's another thing I'd say that owes to the Catholic Church's validity.
One more thing, and then I'll kind of go ahead, Megan. Sorry,
Sorry, Shannon. does the magisterium change its mind when confronted with new and interesting evidence? Because you said that we can go and challenge and present our case. Has the magisterium ever come to a different understanding than one they had previously reached about an issue?
Have they ever said, well, damn?
Well, you're wrong.
It's never done anything close to a 180 on any position. It has updated positions, of course. I mean, that was the whole point of Vatican II under John Paul II, of course, was to update large swaths of Catholic teaching to make it, more understandable to the modern man and things like that. But another big one, I would say, sort of along those lines, was when the incident at Lourdes initially happened. I believe it was Mary's Assumption into heaven wasn't officially, canonized, I should say, into church doctrine. And then after Lourdes happened and there was evidence presented, the magisterium went through the scriptures. And, this little girl, essentially, who came out of nowhere and said, hey, the Virgin Mary told me to dig here, and all of a sudden there was a well. When presented with things like that, the church said, well, okay, I guess we have something new to add to our doctrine here, and things like that. So they won't add anything that's directly contradictory unless they've been absolutely shown that they've been wrong in it for like the past, hundreds of years and such. But it is possible to change interpretations of things, to update them, and to add things that might not have been previously seen as necessary or things along that line.
Okay. Sorry, there was a follow-up question. Then I promised Shannon I'm going to be quiet.
Okay, you go. Yeah.
So if the magisterium updates and revises its position as is necessary based on the evidence presented to it, how is it reaching an objective truth that exists outside of human reasoning and outside of the Bible as an historical resource? If they are the people charged with giving objective truth, objective spiritual truth to humanity, how is it that objective truth can then change based on evidence?
Okay, so it's not really changing. It's really no different than, say, updating, again, a science textbook.
That's a change, though.
Sometimes science is corrected and, because the past thing was completely wrong. But oftentimes, it's not necessarily a change. It's updating it to be more accurate. So it's not like the thing before it was completely wrong, but it was a necessary step into getting closer to the objective truth.
Okay, but hold on, because if in fact the statement is that you can challenge this governing body in order to challenge what it is that they say, and then they make changes. Changes would be meaningless then if they weren't. The challenge would be meaningless. There'd be no point in doing it if they never change from something that's wrong to something that's right, or something that's incorrect to something that's even more correct. What would be the point of challenging?
Well, it's not. Again, it's sort of not that the thing was incorrect. It was just that our understanding of it has increased, and so there's a better interpretation of it out there. There's, of course, multiple, there have been updates to scientific theories, not because those scientific theories were wrong, but because there has been changes made to them so that we can understand them better, and so that it fits the reality of the situation more closely. It's not that it's wrong or incorrect. It's just that the new thing is more correct than the previous thing.
So then, just to be clear, and then Shannon, please, you can't. But what you're saying, practically speaking, is you can't challenge the authority because there's nothing to change, right? There's nothing to change from you're incorrect to now you will be correct if you adopt what it is that I'm saying, because that's, as it sounds like you're saying, that's an impossibility.
Well, I don't think it's that. What I'm saying is that the challenge is pointless because nothing changes. Things change. It's simply not in, the grandiose matter that, we're used to updating other things. Because this isn't simply a matter of science. It's in fact much more speculative because, again, it's philosophy.
But if it's objective truth, how can it be speculative?
Yeah, that's the...
Well, it's because...
Sorry, this is where I'm getting lost.
Okay, yeah. It's our fault as humans, essentially, because, we don't have a perfect grasp on objective truth. We have sort of our flawed perception of it, and we try to, grasp straws at it more and more to, again, sort of refer back to Hegel. That's why that's not why he created the dialectic, obviously. But, the dialectic is older than him. And it's in some sense, you come to the dialectic and you come to a compromise of between two things and you get the more correct thing. You got thesis and antithesis. And eventually you bring them together to get something better. And that's sort of that process.
You can't have it both ways, man. I mean, I don't mean to cut you off, but you can't have it both ways. It's like there's not like you're right and then you're even more right. That's not how this works. Either they can be challenged and change their position because it's wrong or incorrect, or you can't, right? You can't. You can't say that, well, they're fallible humans, so that then they can update things, right? They're either fallible or they're not fallible. And it seems like if there's objective truth, what Megan is saying, if there's objective truth that they have the monopoly on and they own it, it's there, they've got it. And the vicar of Christ is making infallible statements. I don't know how that can be challenged in any real way.
Okay, so I sort of see the problem here, but it seems like it's a very sort of black. It seems very much like there's a sort of black and white view on the whole objective status thing, because I believe just because it's sort of like someone I know did a sort of response to this. I believe it was someone completely unrelated to religion. I think it was Danny Jachamp in sort of Talking to the Amazing Atheist, making a response video at. But it's like this belief that, when it comes to things like theoretical math, we have, this interpretation of a system or how it works, and then we add more to it. So it's not like the previous system was wrong. There's just a greater expansion of it. And just because we don't have the objective truth, or we don't know for sure what the objective truth is, doesn't mean we can't approximate it. Because again, just because we're fallible doesn't mean we can't get close. Like, I understand, the idea that we're wrong and we're always going to come up with subjectiveness and things like that. And it's hard to get it to exactly what's true, but there is, there's some reasonable approximations we can make, I think. Like, you don't have to be a complete skeptic on the matter, sort of.
Okay, I'm going to try to get my question in, because I think this
Sorry.
goes into my question. Yeah, no, absolutely. Don't worry. You're good. Those fantastic questions. I enjoy listening. So this goes into my question, which I think kind of mirrors it. And this is where my confusion comes in, because you're saying essentially, if I'm understanding correctly, what I'm gleaning from this conversation is that most average people can't realistically understand or interpret the Bible. That falls on the magistrate of the Catholic Church. People who have the same educational background as the magistrate of the Catholic Church, but aren't Christians, aren't as authoritative as they are, because they don't have the belief in the spiritual components of the scripture that you need in order to be able to interpret it.
Or Shannon, further, that aren't Catholic Christians.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That are Catholic Christians. Okay, so that's another step. So not for lay people, not for people who are atheists or of a different denomination than Catholicism, even despite educational background or surpassed educational background. So then we get to the magistrate, and those are our authority. And that is who we turn to if we want to know the biblical truth. And then it becomes more complex, because your source for truth, your source for understanding, is inarguably human and fallible, and you've made many concessions that admit that their interpretations are subject to change, but they're subject to change only within the realm of acceptable canon. So like if something, so their bias and their expertise may not even surpass the expertise of a layperson or somebody who is elsewhere in a different church, but they're the authority that gets to interpret it for everybody else, and they're unquestionable, but admittedly fallible, and they've made mistakes in the past, and there have been changes, but that's okay, and that's our source for truth, because we're just human, and that's the best we can do, but that's the truth. Can you, No,
that was a very... Well, I'm sorry, finish your question and I'll answer.
No, I don't even know if it was a question. It's just like, I don't
No,
Is that right? Is that right? Because that's what I'm understanding.
And we love you, Prag. We love you, man.
But
no,
like, is that right? Is that the way the Catholics look at it? Is that a fair summation?
Oh, well, no, because it's a somewhat hyperbolic description, but in essence, it is, somewhat fair. And again, I pointed this out before. You can challenge the magisterium. The reason things change within sort of certain,
But how do you glean truth then? Why are they the authority if they're subject to be challenged? If you're able to challenge them, what gives them authority?
Can hold on. Can we challenge Einstein on certain aspects of the theory of
Einstein
relativity?
doesn't speak for God.
Yeah, but
Hold on. No. It's an analogous situation, though. Like, we can challenge scientific authorities on certain theories in order to update them.
All of them.
But Prag, it sounds like that challenge is in your mind equivalent to shooting a BB at a battleship. And
No.
Challenge it, but I mean.
Well, I mean. You can challenge Einstein to some extent on the theory of relativity, and if it turns out the theory of relativity is completely garbage, well then we have to toss it out. But being that general relativity is generally accepted as quote unquote objective truth, it's not really a matter of saying, well, we're tearing down Einstein because he was completely wrong. But it's just a matter of updating his model.
Right? Let's take it out of the hyperbolic. There's a high, middle, and low chronology in ancient Near Eastern history, right? Which, could be 50 years swing, in setting the timetable in the ancient Near East, right? So people hold to a middle chronology, people hold to a high chronology, people hold to a low. That's debated, right? You can challenge the middle chronology, which is what most people tend to use. And the middle chronology could be wrong, right? It's not that it would have these...
it wouldn't have massive earth-shaking consequences for the study of history.
But the point is that you can challenge it and prove it to be wrong, right? The thing is, I don't see that, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here. I want it to be apparent that while, like, in theory, you could challenge the magistrate or the magisterium or whatever, they can't be wrong, is what you say. I mean, essentially, practically speaking, they can't be wrong. They could be right or even righter, but they can't really be wrong.
They can be the most rightest.
The most rightest, or
sorry, that's
the most
a dig at our 5-year-old, not to dig at you.
Yeah. Sorry, that's just us being stupid. It has nothing to do with you, Prag.
I understand the question, and it's simply a matter of like dealing with one realm over the other. Because I mean, the things you're describing again in the realm of science and this sort of empirical world are things that are commonly accepted. What you're essentially describing, or in vague terms are describing, is essentially the scientific method. And, and of course things can be completely wrong in the scientific method. Of course, it's a little bit different in philosophy, but it's essentially the same thing with some caveats, because, the philosophical battle over whether there is objectively wrong and right goes on and on. And of course, this is again dealing with matters of presuppositions and what you take to be true in terms of your sort of underlying philosophical beliefs. And so really, at the end of the day, what we're boiling down to essentially is, are you going to accept the grounds of someone like the ancient Greeks in terms of like Plato and Aristotle and their philosophical basis versus sort of a different one in how we go about acquiring truth? Because if you reject sort of Plato and Aristotle in that ancient Greek basis, then yeah, you can kind of toss out the rest of church teaching, because that goes a long way to destroying a lot of that. And so, but of course, that's really where the debate we're having lies at right now, with a central philosophical assumptions in things like that. But I understand what you're talking about. Like, again, if you want to have the conversation about that philosophy, I could have it. I wouldn't be the best. I could actually recommend someone else who I think Shannon knows from Twitter.
Classical theist.
Yes, she knew what I was going to say. She's on the ball.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, he's one of those guys, even though he's a layperson. I'm hesitant to say he's quote unquote specially trained, but he's certainly more knowledgeable than me or some other folks. And so,
is he qualified to talk about this, Prag? Because
more qualified than me, I'll say that.
Right, but I mean, like, sorry, I'm not trying to be silly here, but I mean, like, why do you feel comfortable with him making these arguments? Why do you feel comfortable making these arguments? You're a layperson.
I am, yes. Well, I think there's obviously, there's truth in testimony. Like, you can accept testimony as truth, I think, to some extent. Like, again, it's more of a faith thing when you accept truth from other people, of course. But, it's not like testimony has ever contained no truth. Like, you trust the people reporting that the thing called the atom exists, and I trust them too, of course. And it's just, it's different matter, so we lend different amounts of faith to these sorts of things.
We can see photos of atoms now, though, to be fair. Like, they found a way to...
They're on Google.
Yeah. Go on, actually, the last video that was done by my friend John from Stated Clearly actually showed the photos.
If I could take a picture of the form of circularness, believe me, I would. But unfortunately...
You can't, yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to dig up Plato's corpse and ask him what can be done, but...
Oh, well, please don't. Please don't do that. All right, we have another super chat. Yay, super chat. This one is for you, Digital Hammurabi, and it's, again, from Godless Recovery. Thank you, Godless Recovery. And it's DH, how literal was the Enuma Elish originally taken?
The $64,000 question.
How long do you have?
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, gosh.
You want to do it? You want me
No,
to?
you go for it.
I mean, okay. I would say my response is that might not be a good question to ask. In the same way, that sounds really evasive, but in the same way, if I read one of the Psalms and it said, day and night my tears have been my food, asking the question, is that true? That wouldn't be like a good question to ask. If that, what do you mean? Is that true? Because it implies certain things about the genre of that statement, right? You wouldn't ask, is a poem true? You might say, is what the poem is intending true? That would be a fair question. But is the poem true? So I preface any discussion about these ritual texts, these mythological ritual texts, in sort of that light. It's hard to get into the brain, right, of an ancient. I think there's certain ways we can get at it, but not ultimately, obviously. But the reason that it's complicated, I don't know, is the answer. But that being said, I suspect more literal than not. But it's complicated because that, without going into a whole lot of detail, that southern text, did I already talk about this? I don't remember the Asher.
Very, very briefly, not in any detail.
I don't remember what I say. I'm really sorry. That text is a southern text. It's a Babylonian composition, right? When the northern, right, I did talk about this. Yeah. When the northern Assyrians conquered, they took that story up with them and they put Asher's name, the northern city god, in place of Marduk's name, right? Even when it was ridiculous to do so. If you and I were to be there and to do that, we would go, well, we know this story was written by these other people about this other god.
And they knew it.
And they knew
that
it.
Wasn't the point. It was more of our God is better than your God. Your God did this. Well, guess what? We've decided our God actually did that.
Which explains, I think, pretty well why you have then, in this period, a creation story or two about Yahweh being the one that actually creates the universe, right? He's the one that's actually the all-powerful. It wasn't really a question, in my opinion, it wasn't really a question of, did they really think that Tiamat's eyes were used as a source of the Tigris and the Euphrates River? Probably, but I mean, I don't know. But I don't know that that's the most relevant question. That being said, if you look, there's a Babylonian map of the world that, shows Babylon in the middle, and then, the ocean around the flat earth, and then the distant regions where, past the ends of the earth, the
Where
flood survivor lived.
Gods and mythical creatures and where they lived.
That's what they thought, right? So, and actually, I'm hoping to do soon, as a little teaser here, maybe on the non sequitur, I don't know, but a show about the Bible's presentation of the flat Earth. I think that's going to be kind of cool.
That is a non sequitur type of thing.
Yeah. But yeah,
my two favorite topics.
That's a tough question. I think probably more so than not, but it's hard to nail down.
All right. So we have one more super chat from Chad Atchison. So thank you, Chad. He said, my apologies for breaking the like button. We forgive you, Chad. I don't think it was your fault. We lost all our likes at one point. It was weird. It was like everybody just took them away. Which like what? But I think we're back up again.
Something, and then they all went away.
Oh man.
Yeah, they all just went away. It was the weirdest thing.
Can we re-like? Are people trying again?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's okay. People can
We'll
like it after the stream is over. Go like after the stream is over. Go like, because apparently you're not allowed to like it now. Yeah, so we are, holy smokes, overtime. I was hoping we would go for an hour. We've went an hour and a half because this is fantastic. I actually got a bunch of messages by people saying that this was awesome.
Oh, great.
So do you guys, and I want to give you guys a chance to, is there anything more that you guys feel like you have to suss out? I have a little more time if you feel like you have anything more to bring up, or we can do closing statements, whatever works best for you, because I've taken up a lot of your time.
No, I just want to say I really enjoyed this. It was really interesting.
I like you, Pragmatic Culture.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed this conversation very much. You guys are very knowledgeable, and I appreciate it. But I would like to say, not to you guys, but I'm being attacked in the chat right now by this. Yes, by this Shane fellow, and my feelings have been very hurt. I've been called a sophist, and hold on, let me read out this one chat thing. Only God knows why you would proudly self-identify as a narcissist. Though I don't know, Shane, if you're aware of this thing called, comedy. It's a bit of a, something we do called, self-degradation when people make jokes, but okay. No, I'm being snarky now, but he goes on to say, and this is something else. Nevertheless, your willful ignorance and arrogance is evidence of your narcissism. I mean, look, I'm ignorant on certain things. I'm arrogant about some things sometimes. I'm not saying that. I just don't think, I'm not the least qualified guy in the world. He also called me a sophist, but whatever. I just felt my feelings got very hurt by that, and I felt like I had to address it. But that's
I didn't invite you here so that your feelings could be hurt. I'm sorry that your feelings were hurt, and I get along quite well with Shane, so I'm sorry that Shane hurt your feelings, and Shane, don't hurt his feelings, I guess. I can't soften anymore because it gives him the sads. No, don't give Shane any more of the sads, or don't give Craig any more of the sads. He can't concentrate when he has the sads. And Steve says, going over means it's good. Thank you, Steve Bauman. Steve, the conversation was fantastic, and I thank you both. And I will give both of you an opportunity to have some closing statements. I'll let you go first, Digital, Hammurabi, Megan, and Josh, because Prag's vastly outnumbered, so I'll let him have the last one. So go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I were going to say anything, it would be that I think it's extraordinarily important for everyone, lay and academic alike, to strive to learn as much as possible in these fields. We don't get academics without lay people striving to learn. I remember when I was in the Air Force, 17 years old, just consuming books. And I learned I had some of the craziest interpretations of the Bible. But you know what? It's by persevering and learning more and finding people that know and that you trust. And please make them the consensus, part of the consensus view. That would be really important to me. But I think we shoot ourselves proverbially in the foot if we move away from the laity. It sounds so bad, but normal people that are yet to be educated in these fields. If we go away from them, encouraging people like me actively to learn, right? I think that's the whole reason we've done Digital Hammurabi, because look, I teach Sumerian, right? I just put up my 6th Sumerian, learn to read Sumerian class, and we've got tons of people doing it. It's had like 9,000 views, which is insane to me and amazing.
Sumerologists around the world are reeling.
Yeah,
that it's this interesting to other people. But this is the thing. If you tell people that they have no right to interpret something and they have no right to hold an opinion on something, 99% of them are going to say, well, fuck you.
Yeah.
I'm going to go and find another field that I'm welcomed into. So I think you kill interest and you kill scholarship, and it really does the whole of humanity a massive disservice.
And so what I will say to close, another shameless plug, we just started Learn to Read Biblical Hebrew on the channel. I just put up the first lesson tonight. It's the alphabet and the alphabet song, which it's
awesome.
me singing it with my guitar. I apologize. I couldn't think of anything else. But I'm going to teach you guys, if you want to, how to read Biblical Hebrew, and it's not that tough. So, if you're one of these, amateurs that wants to get in and read the Hebrew Bible, come watch the videos. I'll make it happen. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. And thank you guys for all you do. You guys, like Christy said in the chat, you guys are essentially giving people a free education. And that's fantastic.
Very happy to do
We
it.
very much appreciate you.
We've been very lucky, and it's important to try and...
Which is why I want to throw you in front of as many people as I can. So go subscribe.
Thank you.
All right, Prag, your turn. What are your closing statements, sir? And thank you for coming into the lion's den with all of us equally.
Thank you again, Shannon, for having me on. And thanks to, of course, Megan and Josh for being very polite and very learned interlocutors, to use the overly large word about it. No, this is very fun. And I completely agree with what Josh said. Go out, learn ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek, learn Koine, learn Latin, learn ancient Hebrew and all that good stuff. And go be a biblical scholar so you can update your understanding of the Bible, and then eventually convert to Catholicism, because that's where it will lead. And also, I would like to point out that Josh has thanked me for appearing, and I did just get a notification that he has apparently subscribed to my channel. So I think all bad blood has finally been washed away. Thank you, Shane. I appreciate it.
That's awesome. All right. Well, I'm glad that we could build bridges here on the Shannon Q channel. That's good. All right. And thank you, everybody, for the chat. Thank you, all of the people, for the super chats. We really appreciate it. And by we, I mean me, I guess. And I don't know, Paul probably appreciates it. He does stuff. So thank you very much. And have a good night, guys. Bye.
Bye.